All right, we're live. My name is Bob Miller. I am filling in for Mike Riggs. Anybody that knows Mike Riggs knows I am not him, but I'm filling in for him to get this session going. And I'm going to let Dave Pearson have the floor here. I was just going to say that the sponsor of this session is Proficio, and I'm going to find our sponsor, and I'll include him toward the end so he gets a chance to talk. Dave, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you go.
Sounds good. And yeah, Mike is a really great guy. I got a chance to talk to him a little bit earlier, so really looking forward to having him join here when he's able to. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, I hope. Alrighty. So I'm assuming everybody can see my screen unless I hear otherwise. So I will go ahead and props to ChatGPT for building this image on the home screen here. I gave it a tiny prompt and it came back with a pretty killer graphic that I think fits well with the topic. So I'm David. This is my talk, and we're focused on essentially stopping very large campaigns with very little information that can be automatically generated. So just really quickly, who am I? So I've been around security professionally for over a decade, a couple of degrees in the security space, but have worked in both gov space and also starting and running a threat research team for a network detection and response platform for about 5 years. And I've spoken at all sorts of different conferences. I taught a 3-hour workshop at DEF CON, did a couple of other presentations. These are the ones of note so far. So have been around for a while, doing a lot of different things. Today, I wanted to talk, right? So we're focused on stopping large scale attacks with very little information. So I wanted to kind of lay things out by showing what, the differences are between identification and sharing between malware and phishing. And phishing is a stand-in for anything that shares URLs. So this is still applicable beyond phishing, but phishing is our focus at base. And then why does traditional hashing fail for sharing indicators of compromise for domains and URLs? Then we'll walk into what are site fingerprints and how do we actually use them to identify these large-scale campaigns. We'll talk about one specifically that has 150,000 indicators that are identified by just 150,000 unique submissions to our platform that are all identified by just 3 indicators. Finally, we'll finish off with what is the open source? What are we releasing, making available so that you can use this information in your operations? So I wanted to start on the malware side, right? I think a lot of people are more familiar. There's lots of threat reports that come out all day, every day. And they share, usually it's, really good research at the top, hopefully. And at the bottom, you'll have indicators of compromise, things that they want to share to other people so that they can look for things either reactively or potentially proactively going forward in their environments. And so I'm using TrustWave, a pretty good company. Their threat research team is really good. I wanted to use a couple of stories from their Spider Labs, which is their threat intelligence group, to talk about this difference between phishing and malware. So we'll talk about malicious PDFs from the malware side of things. And so if you think about, again, there's a whole bunch of good research there. And then at the end, we have a few indicators of compromise. We've got a file name, we got hashes, or just a hash. And then in this case, they didn't provide Yara, but Yara would be essentially the open source way to share rules so that you can detect this across platforms without being vendor locked in, right? So thinking about those different pieces, how do they fit into maybe these 4 dimensions that you could score things on, if you will? So things that you're looking for are identification and the ability to share that has longevity, things that are very low or unlikely for false positives, things that are very low or unlikely for false negatives, and then finally, as little effort as possible, not because we're lazy, but because we have too much to do. So how do we essentially have all of these things as far to the right on these dimensions as possible? So let's look at those different characteristics. So the indicators of compromise from this, from the malware, we start with name. Now, again, this is a little subjective, so I'm happy to talk about more specifics here, but longevity of name depends on how long the campaign is. It depends on how sophisticated it is. If it's really, really targeted, maybe there's only one name. If it's kind of all over the place, maybe there's a few names, but it's going to last you some amount of time. However, there's going to be lots and lots of false positives because lots of things are named the same. It has no underlying connection to the content. False negatives, again, it depends on how specific the attack is and all of that stuff. But if it's not super, super targeted, you're going to have a whole bunch of things that have other names that you're going to miss. So it's going to be very, very little use from a false negative perspective. And then finally, from an effort perspective, it's a name. You can literally just have that automatically captured and shared with somebody. So no effort at all. If you think about hashes of the content from the malware, the PDF that we're hashing in this case, longevity, a little bit longer, right? Because you're actually identifying that content and you can go ahead and look at that irrespective of the name changing. Maybe the attacker doesn't change their tooling in between attacks, but they change the name. Then false positive likelihood, right? It's a hash. So it should, barring collisions and other stuff that's outside of the scope of this, it's unlikely that you'll have false positives. But of course, depending on how prolific and different the attack is, if it's polymorphic, for example, this would change. A hash is pretty good for false negatives, but not great. There could be other scenarios that you're going to miss. Finally, effort, again, automatically calculated, hash, so no effort at all. Yara, right? So Yara are these rules that you're able to put together that allow you to describe things with more detail and context. Usually, so I'm treating this as if it's a good Yara rule written by people who know what they're doing. Longevity should be good, should be a long time. False positive likelihood should be low. False negative likelihood, again, should be low. But the effort, again, at the beginning of this, I mentioned you need somebody who really knows what they're doing or a group who knows what they're doing. Effort is higher, right? It's not automated. You might be able to have ChatGPT or some other generative AI help you, but you're still going to need to do work to really make it as valuable as you need. So then you're from the malware side of things, right? Your decision is, do I want to track a few hashes per attack, or should I create and maintain Yara rules or one rule, depending on what it is? It's very much dependent on how popular is this attack, how important is it, how long-lived it is, etc. And how well-staffed you are, I should add. Now let's go to phishing, and phishing is a stand-in for anything where URLs are shared. This is another TrustWave blog post, another really good one. Carla's a really talented threat intelligence analyst. And so this is one focused on identifying phishing that's leveraging Cloudflare's R2 public buckets. Cloudflare's R2 is like Amazon's S3. I guess they just decided to shift their letters and their numbers left by one. Anyway, so at the end of this intelligence report, they had a handful of IOCs, and I literally mean just a handful. And so they actually identified a bunch of different attacks here, but they shared one indicator of compromise, one or more, a couple per attack. They just shared the IOCs, right? They didn't do any additional work, which is fine. But they could have included things like indicator of kit, which is a Sigma-based phishing kit identifier. And then there's Sublime, which is a popular open source kind of proof point, if you will. They could have included those kinds of things. They had no incentive to do it, but there weren't any provided. But that would be another way that people could share information. Again, same 4 dimensions. Let's start with URL, right? So you're sharing a very specific URL. The way I view URLs as IOCs is they're literally used once and then they're no longer useful. It might even, the identifier might even change between you sending it and somebody else using it. So it's very, very low longevity. Hours to days is potentially too long. False positive likelihood, again, it should be very specific. So there should be an unlikely false positive unless the detection was wrong. False negative, though, of course, you're going to have a lot of different other things. One that really irks me is I'll see Google Safe Browsing, for example, will identify one very specific path on a compromised website and then miss something that's in the next directory or with the next file name, even though it's the same thing. So false negatives all over the place. Effort, though, of course, is just about nothing. As long as you can extract the URL from the link or whatever, very, very low effort. Then you have indicator of kit or Sublime, which is a stand-in for Yara for URLs or domains. Longevity, false positive, false negative likelihood, they're all really good numbers there. Really does do good work when you're able to put the time and effort into it. That's the caveat. That's the trade-off that you need to make for creating those things, because if you want them to be maintained and good, you really need to have them exist for a long time. You need to maintain them. You got all sorts of different things. You're not going to do that for a one-time attack, and then so you're essentially between, am I perpetually out of date trying to catch up with what the newest attack version is, or do I write an IOK/Sublime rule and have to maintain that and decide when to expire them and all this stuff, right? It's a lot of work. Most organizations don't have that effort, and it's really, really a slog. So my view is we really need a hash-like option for identifying and sharing phishing. Now I say hash-like because of two reasons. First, so here's VirusTotal. Here's one of those URLs that we'll talk about a little bit more here as we go. They already do a hash, right? They got a body SHA-256. We already have it. It's absolutely useless. So it's going to identify that specific attack, and it's not going to identify anything else that's similar. So how is this different, right? The way I look at it is HTML is a little bit different than a file, than like a malicious file that's downloaded, because there's so many different places where you have an identifier that's maybe different, or maybe the attacker loaded the file from a slightly different location. They have a different hosting provider, so the link is different. They've got a different exfiltration domain. So that's different. All of those things, even the spacing, literally just an extra space or the removal of a space completely changes the hash in a way that you can't figure out. So that is useless, right? You can, again, it's essentially a URL without a URL identifier. It's a little bit easier to share. So let's enter Site Fingerprints. A little bit of background on this. We see, millions per month of things that we're analyzing with our platform-based intelligence, and there are lots and lots more than that out there in the world that are going all the time. Attacks, not attacks, etc. The vast majority of content that is built on the web, especially when you're focused on either portals or phishing kits or templates of websites, they're very much templated, right? They're essentially slot in your content to something that somebody else has already built. What Site Fingerprints do is actually capture the structure of the template rather than the very precise content within. So here's an example on the left. Going to the right, we got a phishing portal. It's a Microsoft login portal. It looks like a legitimate Microsoft login portal. If I had more room on the page, I'd show you. It looks identical. That's the phishing portal. Underneath that, you've got the HTML. The HTML will hash to something very, very precise, but the structure of it, the content that's associated with it, like the script tags and different things like that, they will carry a different kind of identifier that allow us to find those things over time. We can do the same thing for the links that we see in the hrefs, for example, on here, and then for the destinations that we see. All of those different things we can group together and create a hash on top of them. That's what we call our Site Fingerprints. What that allows us to do is actually group and cluster automatically all of the different things that look the same. So this is a graph that came out of our intelligence feed where Microsoft is that center dot So attacks targeting Microsoft credentials. Microsoft is the center dot, and essentially the thing that I'm pointing to with the automatically grouped arrow is the attack that we're going to talk about. This was over the course of a couple of days, so there are not nearly as many dots as we'll talk about, the 100,000 dots that we'll talk about, but this was saying we automatically group it. We didn't need to know that it was bad, but we were able to automatically group it and identify, hey, these all look the same. And that was just from the structural ID, which was the structure of the template. So if you think about where that fits into our dimensions, right? Longevity should be long. In fact, the attack that we'll talk about a little bit later, our system's only been around since late May with Site Fingerprints. URL scan and other things like that have existed for much longer. We're actually able to go back, look at the exact same content within URL scan back to, I think it was March of 2020. So perfect timing for COVID. But anyway, the exact same attack we can identify from then all the way through today with 3 indicators that we'll talk about a little bit later. That's crazy. So longevity, very, very long. False positive likelihood, again, very low. There is room for some false positives if somebody's using something that's identical to something else, but a little bit different. But generally speaking, we've run across one case in 6 months where a false positive would have been created. It wasn't created, but it would have been. And then false negatives, again, we're able to identify this structure. So we're able to see these things that would have otherwise been false negatives in other kinds of paradigms. They aren't for ours. Effort, it's automatically created. If you want to put context on top of it, like a sublime rule, you can do that, but you don't need to. So let's actually walk through this 100,000 plus attack. Just want to highlight, everything that we're going to show below is 100% free to access. At worst, you'd need a free account, but I think most of it's actually like 100% you can access it. We had a very specific URL. The domain ended in 5d9.r2.dev. This is the same result in our system in base, which you can access. We could access it right here if we wanted, but we'll just go through the steps here. So this is the screenshot for that particular one and looks clear as day like a Microsoft login portal. If we scroll a little bit farther down that page, what you'll see is we automatically calculated the site fingerprints for the phishing destination 5d9.r2.dev. The structural ID, the one that captures the template structure, starts in 0098. So we can go ahead and click on the See Details button here and we'd pivot into the next screen, which shows here are the insights that base automatically calculated for that site fingerprint. 0098, blah, 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 blah. Users can add additional context on top of that. In this case, somebody or the machine added the attack type phishing to it, but that doesn't need to be there. The rest of it is automatically calculated and is calculated all the time on everything. So we're able to see when was it first seen, May 30th. And I mentioned a little bit earlier, we've only been around. Site Fingerprints went live on May 30th. So we've seen it since it's gone live, all the way through. I made this slide yesterday, so all the way through current day. And then we're seeing how many times was it seen? 56,000 times just for this one individual identifier. So we've had 56,000 different submissions to the platform across 6.5 months, all that are identified by just this one identifier. Then if you go in and look, if you're scrolling down the screen still from that last page, there's additional metadata that's available. When this is identified as an indicator of compromise within base or external, you would have additional context. So in this case, we're able to see in the last 24 hours, how many final destinations, so the phishing portals, and then how many credential collection destinations, aka what happens when you click next, where does the information go? That's automatically pulled out and referenced, and that's available with the context to this particular identifier. And then in this case, we had additional human context. Think of like a Yara rule, like a Sigma rule. We added a campaign. This campaign is known as rand string. So you can click on that, pivot into that, and then you'll find what are the details for that. So I'm going to ignore the top because that's a human adding stuff, but the bottom is automatically calculated. So the fact that it exists as a campaign in the system, automatically in perpetuity, it'll be calculated. What have we seen for this whole campaign? In the last 24 hours, 400 odd domains across a few indicators that we'll see in a second. And we've seen it 151,000 times. If you, again, you're just scrolling down the screen here. If you then look at what the actual times seen are for those indicators, 150,000 plus different submissions to base automatically grouped into this one attack from these three indicators. And this is the one that goes back 3.5 years. If you look at like a URL scan or somebody else that has historical data. So open source, what are we making available? So we've got two different repositories. Base Intelligence is the GitHub organization that we have. We have durable IOCs and then Site Fingerprints. If you want to map them, and they're MIT open source, you can do whatever you want with them. If you map them to what the platform has in them, what you'll see is a little bit earlier, the left little gray screen here is what it looks like in the platform. So we have fake Microsoft portal template, some description, what identifier it's associated with, and then how many times have we seen it in the last 24 hours, what campaign is it associated with. On the durable IOCs, the only thing that we don't include there is the unique activity in the last 24 hours. We capture everything else. So you're able to see what indicator type, what indicator value, how many times have we seen it, first, last seen, and then links back into the platform if you want to look at it there. So we're making that available. You can literally consume that wherever you want in any environment. Then the Site Fingerprints functionality, which is essentially anytime a user or the system adds a tag to base. So we have the tag attack type phishing here. Anytime that's added, every hour, we have a process that goes through and collects all the new tags that have been added and automatically publishes them up to our repository here. So this is really powerful because it allows you to identify what, like a whole bunch of different things. So in this one, we have attack type phishing. We have tags for open directories with content versus open directories that don't have content, hunting for Cloudflare warnings, all sorts of different things. But automatically, this is anytime somebody adds a tag in base, it gets pulled up here, and then you can use that in any other place you want. So I think that's pretty well all of the content that I had right now. I saw 7 different messages in chat, and I also know that I saw Mike was able to join, so I don't know how you guys want to proceed from here. Either the hosts, do you want to introduce Mike, or do you want to field questions?
Yeah. We still have plenty of time, but yeah, if you'd like to do that now, I can bring him on. So hang on just a second.
Yep.
Hey everybody.
Hey, Mike.
Good afternoon. Sorry for the little hiccup getting on this morning.
Go right ahead, Mike. Job. Introduce yourself and your company. Yeah.
Yeah, great job, David. Yeah, my name is Mike Shoemate. I work with Proficio. We are a global MDR provider headquartered out in San Diego, California. And we've been helping a lot of our organizations, large enterprises, protect their operations from threats, targeted attacks for over 10 years now. And recently we've kind of retooled our platform for the MSP market to, simplify it a little bit, but also make sure we're providing the response and detection coverage that our partners in the MSP space are looking for. So what our customers have been asking for and what they're looking for is, how do you help us protect the 3 real targeted attack vectors inside their infrastructure? First is on the perimeter of their networks. where we do detection and we can do automatic blocking on their firewalls. Okay. Specifically, we also move to the endpoint. So at the endpoint, we have the ability to detect and isolate endpoints when they're being targeted for ransomware and malware inside the MSP infrastructure. And then finally, the stuff that David just talked about is probably the most important, which is identity and users. We have the ability to monitor users and lock user accounts when it looks like their credentials have been compromised because they've been phished. Okay. Here at Proficio, we have hundreds of customers that we are monitoring in this cyber war every single day. And over 60% of our targeted attacks start with the users and their credentials being compromised. And that's because phishing has become so complicated for the people to detect. It's really easy to phish most normal users these days. So being able to quickly identify that stuff, integrate with Office 365, tie into the Azure platform with APIs, see suspicious logins, geographic logins, locking those accounts, that's a huge capability for lowering the risk of your organization. So really, it's pretty simple. We work with our customers to set up detection at the perimeter, the endpoint, and the users of our client environments. And then we can do some dark web scanning where we will monitor URLs and we will report back to customers when we're finding data out there on the dark web that's sensitive to the organization. So credentials, financials, things like that. So great talk, David. Really valuable. And I think that people need to understand. I feel like I'm a personal phishing counselor for my family.
Yeah, I know I get a call from my mother every now and then. She says, "Hey, I'm looking at this. Should I be clicking on this?" And I said, "Mom, don't click on anything, really.
Don't click on anything.
Don't click anything. It's okay." Yeah, absolutely. Dave, in reality, from your perspective, how have things changed? Because we got a few minutes. So, we can fill it. If anybody's got questions, be sure and put them in chat so we can see them. But how have things changed over the last few years as it relates to the tactics that are getting used? I know they're more sophisticated, but I don't know that some people may not even know how they start, where they started and where they are now, the difference between.
Yeah, I think a lot of things changed. I mean, post-COVID, of course, lots of people were bored, stuck inside and looking for things to do. And some of those were not so honorable. But some of the things that we've seen are, of course, we've seen a lot of QR codes. So there's a lot of that's been going on. I think there's been well publicized and many researchers talking about the widespread QR code attacks that were targeting Microsoft credentials earlier this year. So that's a big threat space that we've seen. That's one space that shows up. Other than that, we're seeing, phishing as a service obviously is a thing that's continued to everything as a service. Attackers can have subscriptions just like defenders can. So there's a lot of that too. And I can't say personally that I've seen it happen yet, but I fully suspect that with generative AI and things like that, phishing as a service is going to go to a different level where we have attacks targeting companies that would have otherwise been maybe under the radar, not valuable enough to be targeted because there's maybe only $10,000 to extort out of them instead of $1 million. That's something where I see an opportunity for criminals, but hopefully not, where we'll just have a higher volume where all of a sudden these groups that have nobody on security, they probably don't have anybody on IT, maybe they have an MSP to help them out when they need it, and maybe probably not even a VC. So those kinds of things where they're getting slammed with all of a sudden this new issue for them that they have to figure out now. That's something that I see to be really interesting. They're the big trends. I mean, there's lots of Web3 stuff that was more popular when everything wasn't in the dumps. So maybe 12, 15 months ago. I do expect that to pick up as we see potentially Web3 starting to pick back up with its valuation. It all rides on what's valuable, right?
Yeah, the thing that I've noticed is that because of the large language models, right, like you're pointing out, that to me that has probably been the biggest change in the last 12 months is that the types of emails that you're getting, the English is a lot better, right? You know what I mean? So they're able to actually run these through language processors, they're I can tell they're going to school on prompt engineering, right? Because I can see that they're not all using, we all know if you use large language models and you don't really put any basic configuration in them, or you don't engineer your prompts correctly, then there's certain words that get reused all the time by these large language models, right? Because that's how they were trained up.
Mm-hmm.
So skyrocket is one of those words, right? You'll see skyrocket in a ton of stuff coming out of those large language models because that had a high frequency for whatever reason in the learning material. But that's the thing I've noticed the biggest change on is they're using generative AI to do the language, and that they can also simulate images a lot better now, right? Because they can actually kind of tune those things. And I know that a lot of the image generation is trying to protect against that. So you can't just say, hey, give me a Coca-Cola logo, you know what I mean, to kind of fool people. But I think that's only because the engines that we're using have been trained by people that have rules. What I really think is going to come down the way, just like you said, this as a service sort of a methodology, you can bet that there's lots of money in that part of the business for the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can build your own large language model and you can train your own large language model up, to do what you want it to do specifically. So there's going to come a time when they're going to have their hands on an engine that doesn't restrict them, from use, right? And then I think that's when things are going to get very interesting. Voter fraud and, extortion and everything else that we can imagine,
Mm-hmm.
at some point is gonna be an issue with these AI models, and it's not going to be the ones that are under people's control, that are actually a business.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be from bad guys taking the time and the money to build those resources up. You feel that's kind of something we can look forward to?
I mean, my personal opinion is yes. That's a real threat. Why wouldn't attackers build and use this functionality? Why wouldn't there be an evil Open API or Open AI?
Yeah, right.
So it's very, very easy. And, once somebody's shown you how to do it in the prior work and everything, and maybe we have, lots of public content out there, and maybe even just thinking about like take a PhD student who's looking to get their first job and they're promised X $100,000 a year payment, and all of a sudden they're not finding it, and maybe they're either desperate or whatever. It's easy to see plenty of scenarios where somebody ends up going to the dark side, whether or not they really want to, and then building that.
I think we're going to have to get a lot smarter in the future about how and like you said, 80% of them are phishing attacks now. So we know that's going to be the attack plane they're probably going to come at the majority of the time, right? So we're just going to have to we're going to have to evolve our own AI tools to be able to kind of figure some of that out. So
one of the things that Mike mentioned in a chat that we had a little bit earlier that I think is useful here is, a lot of people think, oh, well, I'll just put two-factor authentication and I'm good to go, right? So you can do that within your borders, right? If you have O365 or whatever, you can do that within your organization, but that may save you from your device getting compromised as an organization, but it doesn't mean that the user who's logging in using that same password that just got compromised in a different environment on a bring your own device kind of scenario isn't also now getting their system hacked. So I really think risk is way more complex than a lot of people think by just saying, well, we'll just throw MFA at it. It's, obviously that helps a lot, and there's really, really good reasons to do it, but it's not a cure-all.
Time means everything, man. We've spent so much money building out our response capabilities to help customers react quickly on these kind of things and use, people spend, I tell David this morning, these security tools people are buying are not cheap. And so these things are expensive. It's a lot of money, and you have to take the time to take that last extra step to make sure they're configured properly, and then use them to automate some level of response where you can, because it makes you the least attractive bad guy on the block. If you can say, hey, we can automatically isolate hosts, we can automatically lock user accounts, things like that. That being able to lock accounts, things like, it seems like a simple thing to all of us here because we've been in IT for a long time, but for most of the normal users out there, they're signing up for stuff outside of your control with their credentials at work all over the place. And you know what? They use the same passwords all the time. We know from our own analysis here, they're signing up for Target with their work email, and they're using their same password, then target gets popped. And when they're scanning the dark web, they're not looking for your Hotmail email. They're looking for the email.
That's probably the biggest frustration I have. I'm like you. It's the biggest frustration I have is that if you would just have a little password, I mean, we all know this, right? I mean, we could go off on a tear about it, but the bottom line, if you just had a little bit of discipline in your password maintenance and you were using a password manager, and if you were really using MFA like you were supposed to, then at least it makes it more difficult, right? You're just trying to throw as many trip hazards in front of the bad guys as you can, like you said. So there are all these tools that we have the time and the ability to kind of stop that attack from going much further, right? And the other frustration I have is that companies are buying point products because they're best in class, but they have no idea how to make them work in conjunction with one another. That which I mean, it only gives you a much smaller probability of avoiding a problem, right? When those things are not, when you don't have somebody who understands how to do some analysis work between one system and another and make that information work bidirectionally, right? So those are the kind of people who say, yeah, we got a really good security program and it's all in place, and everything's good, right? But they're talking about lots of point products that aren't really being integrated or at least being analyzed across all of the data planes that are available from.
Yeah.
So
And
what about go ahead.
I was just going to comment really quickly. That's one of the reasons why Base, the way we're approaching most of our sales is through partners and channel, because we recognize, if we're in a tip, for example, that's way more valuable to you than a point product just sitting somewhere that you have to manage separately. So we're very MSP, MSSP, and then tip kind of focused with the go to market.
Yeah, well, you're going to have to be, right? I mean, you got to have somebody that can help do that analysis. That's really the only path forward you got on that case. And I see that the guys are talking about in chat, they're talking about, even multi-factor or 2FA. We got man-in-the-middle attacks that we didn't necessarily have by token stealing and all those other things. Yeah, everybody's right about that. And there's lots of development on the zero trust front, but so all of those things are evolving, but I don't know, we got to really put the spurs to it and make them evolve quickly, right, to get the benefit. I was going to ask you one thing while you were talking. This is the other thing I thought about while you were giving your presentation, and that's user training, like things like KnowBe4 or SAS or these other programs. I mean, how important and what impact does that have, an organization, if they do that correctly?
So I'll give you my practitioner's perspective, and then I'll try to dial it back.
Absolutely.
The way I think about it, and my wife actually literally went through her cybersecurity training for her animal shelter yesterday, and said that it was so basic that she didn't really feel like it was entertaining, but she didn't feel like there was any value conveyed by it. It wasn't one of the big ones. So whether or not they are better, different question. The way that I, as a person, look at this from the field is, it definitely helps to have layers, right? Layers are important, but if you're asking a user who is already focused on this is training to identify something, then maybe they'll have a shot. But if you're putting them under pressure, they got deadlines, they've got some sort of thing that is causing them to believe otherwise, that this is not real. If the site is literally a carbon copy of the real site, training them to spot that the site looks a little different or that the language is different, all these changes, I don't see loading up Karen in accounting with all this additional knowledge that she's going to forget just because she's a human and has her own business work to do. Again, layers are nice and it's helpful, and I think it's definitely useful, but I don't think I would put something like a solution that's actually going to prevent stuff from happening way higher on my budget list.
Okay, makes sense. Mike, you got any feels for that?
It's like I said earlier on, for most organizations, users are by far your biggest risk, and you can spend the time training them. It's just it's difficult. The phishing attacks are so good now. It's so easy to fool people, and people are, I mean, I hate to say this, man, but people are just, when it comes to the passwords and the accounts they want to manage, they're just lazy, and they're gonna use things all over the place, and it's They're just, the bad actors are just looking for a way to, like you were saying earlier, Bob, they're just looking for a way to access inside the account. They don't really care about David and David's particular workstation. That's nothing to them, right? They're just, once they get the account, if people don't see that account accessing the network and seeing the multiple logins and seeing the geographic disparities and things like that, if you're not tracking that and reporting on it, they're going to dwell, and it's going to just be a matter of time at that point.
Yeah, I will, because someone only got a couple minutes and then we'll be done. But I was gonna say that, because this wasn't anecdotal. I actually went through this. So I started teaching a class at a local university, a couple days a week, and they put you through the training, right? They put you through their training. And one of it was phishing training. And I never thought for a minute I would ever say this. That was excellent phishing training. It was hard. It actually made you look at headers. It made you look well below the easy stuff. You could not just and this is me. I mean, I'm the COO of an MSSP too, right? So I mean, and I'm trained up, but I went through this thing. And I says, you know what? I had to actually think about this a couple of times in this. It was great training. So I think the quality of the training has a big impact on what's actually done. If you're just phoning it in and it's easy, I'm with you, David. It's not, it's just checking a box, not really doing anything. I would never thought in a million years that I'd be saying that a state university system had a really excellent phishing training program, but it was very good. You had literally had to look at headers and such to kind of to get through it. That's the only one that I would say really taxed.
The only comments I have on that is that sounds great, and it sounds like I would actually enjoy taking that training. But I think again, like Karen from accounting or anybody, right, who doesn't geek out on ones and zeros or looking at headers would just get lost in the weeds. I would love to know what the average response was to that.
Oh, you can't pass. That's the thing. You have to keep going until you pass it.
Well, no, I don't mean like success or fail. I mean, what did people think?
Right. Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah. But
all right, guys, we're really at the end of the session. Dave, man, it was a great session. I appreciate you giving us all the information, and this is going to be recorded so people can play this back. Mike, it was nice to meet you and hear about Proficio. So I thank you very much, gentlemen, and we will go on to our next session. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, David.
See you next month.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
All right. All right. We're out.